South Korea-Japan ties could be worse. They do still officially share military intelligence through the GSOMIA pact that was revived at the last minute last week, but they could also be a lot better. The problem is, GSOMIA came to be a focal point of what's wrong with Seoul-Tokyo ties, but deciding to keep the agreement going, albeit conditionally subject to future negotiations, is not going to fix all those other issues. The outlook remains fairly bleak because so much is yet to be done. And even South Korea's provisional compromise on GSOMIA was met with a smug response in Japan. Consider these newspaper responses. The Asahi Shimbun quoted Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe as telling associates that Tokyo had not conceded anything to Seoul. The Mainichi Shimbun reported an unnamed Japanese Foreign Ministry official boasting that Tokyo had managed to turn a WTO dispute into a matter for bilateral discussions without even playing its cards. And the Sankei Shimbun's claim that a senior Japanese official has described the GSOMIA breakthrough as a nearly perfect game by Tokyo will also have left a bad taste here in Korea. It's true that Seoul did backtrack from its previous position that Japan would have to remove export controls before South Korea would renew their military pact, but in this context, compromise presented an opportunity for progress. Instead, both sides may be even more wary of backing down further. But they need to. If we follow the thread backwards, the GSOMIA standoff came about after Japan hit South Korea with trade curbs on the basis of loss of trust. Tokyo's move was itself seen as a response to South Korea's Supreme Court ruling late last year that Japanese firms should compensate Korean victims of colonial-era forced labor. And then you can keep going back all the way to grievances during Tokyo's rule over this peninsula between 1910 and 45, and in fact centuries of animosity before that. Tokyo maintains bilateral ties were already normalized and compensation issues settled under the terms of a treaty in 1965. That said, it was only later that some of the sorest points of Japanese colonial-era abuse became major public issues. Not only forced labor, but also military sexual slavery. To make matters even tougher, Seoul did agree to settle that latter issue with Tokyo in 2015, but it did so without the consultation of victims, and the agreement was rejected. So, what next? We were told soon after the GSOMIA announcement that Japan might take around a month to lift its trade restrictions. If that does transpire, then at least we could return to the previous status quo, that is, economic ties, military cooperation supporting a trilateral security relationship with the US. But even in that optimistic scenario, if the GSOMIA measure is a band-aid, then trade is just a thicker bandage over deep resentment. Until Seoul and Tokyo are able to squarely face the facts of history together and treat victims appropriately, we are always teetering on the edge of tensions, negative public sentiment, and further stumbling blocks. Realistically, that day might not come until both sides can place dignity ahead of pride. And tragically, at that point, there may be no surviving colonial-era victims left.